Hi everyone, I'm Matt from Look Into Bitcoin, and today we'll be looking at why you should be thinking long-term with your Bitcoin investing and analysis as opposed to making short-term decisions. To do this, we'll be using a number of metrics, all freely available on lookintobitcoin.com, your number one source for Bitcoin information. If you haven't already, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to ensure you're receiving all of our content as soon as it's released. So right now, I think the best way to show this is by looking at the Bitcoin profitable days chart. Now, this is looking at the entire Bitcoin price history and looking at for what portion of that investors are in profit depending on at what time they bought. So as we can see here, the number of days that you could have invested in Bitcoin currently sits at just above 4,300. And for nearly 87% of that entire price history, Bitcoin has been profitable to buy and hold. So as we can see here, the green price chart here, we can see if you'd have bought at any point during this time frame, you have been in profit. You are currently in profit on your Bitcoin position. And just this red period here is the amount of time in which you'd have been underwater or currently are underwater on your position. So as we can see, 87% of time, a Bitcoin investment is currently in profit. Now, of course, this chart is just looking at the time and price at which you invested in Bitcoin. But if you actually look at the amount of drawdown, the longest period of drawdown that has ever been for a Bitcoin investment, we can see if you'd have bought in the peak in 2013 here, it would have taken about 3.5 years for your investment to break even if you'd have bought at the exact price peak there. So if you'd have bought here at about $1,200-ish and had to see price dip beneath $200, it might have seemed like the end of the world. It might have seemed like this was the worst investment decision you could have made. But if you were in it for the long term, if you'd have invested for at least 3.5 years, even today, where a number of Bitcoin investors are currently sitting at a loss, price sits at just around $20,000. You could be up between a 15 and 20x on your initial investment. And this is when times would have seemed incredibly bleak. But if you had invested for the long term rather than the short term, rather than buying at this price peak and having to sell as price went down, as you became overly fearful in the market, investing in the long term has historically been incredibly valuable. And if we look at the other Look Into Bitcoin charts we have here, this can also potentially be outlined pretty nicely with the Fear and Greed Index. So this is looking at current market sentiment in relation to the Bitcoin price. So as we can see, we have a 0 to 100 scale here. We currently sit at a value of 16. And on this scale, a 0 value indicates extreme fear in the market and 100 is extreme greed. So a lot of people making investment decisions for the short term are very much influenced by their emotional feelings and bias at the time. And what we can actually see is this has historically been a very terrible investment thesis. We can see the inverse correlation between price and current market sentiment. As price is bottoming out, that is usually the most fearful periods of the market cycle. And when price is topping out, these are usually the most greedy periods when everyone is very euphoric on price, overly bullish, and that usually indicates an overheated market. So if you are making short-term investment decisions, a lot of the time it is hard to ignore your emotional bias, and we can historically see for a vast majority of Bitcoin investors, this has been a very poor approach to their Bitcoin investing. Lastly, if we just look at a simple market cycle chart, such as the 200-week moving average heat map, what we can see here is if you're investing for the long term, we can see very clear periods where Bitcoin is potentially at a discount for the long-term strategic investor, and when it may be potentially time to start cutting of your position short. So if you're not in the mindset that you want to buy and hold for 5 to 10 years for an indefinite period of time, if you just want to play the long-term cycles and swings in the Bitcoin price, data charts like this and other on-chain metrics that Look Into Bitcoin provides can make this incredibly simple. As we can historically see, these periods where the 200-week moving average has increased a very small amount and we get these dark blue or purple dots here, and especially as we approach the 200-week moving average, which is just the average closing price of the previous 200 weeks of price action, these have historically been great areas to accumulate Bitcoin for the strategic investor. And as we get these overheated market conditions, as we get into the yellow, oranges, and maybe even red dots we see on this chart, historically this has been a great period for profit taking. So even if you're not into Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, for an indefinite period of time and you just want to take advantage of the market cycles of Bitcoin, it's best to look at this with a long-term macro lens and at least be anticipating a position to be held for multiple years at a time, rather than trying to play the speculation and volatile movements that Bitcoin experiences on a day-to-day basis. So just to summarize, thinking long-term for Bitcoin investments and decision-making is not only easier, but has often outperformed those attempting to beat the market. The day-to-day volatility and speculative nature of Bitcoin, and potentially even market manipulation due to this just being a small and fairly new asset class, means trying to beat the market long-term has been incredibly difficult historically, and thinking on a long-term basis for a few years at a time has historically been the best way to invest in Bitcoin. We can also see for 87% of Bitcoin's history through the Bitcoin profitable days chart currently sits in profit. And for a period of 3.5 years, no Bitcoin position has ever been at a loss. We can also see that trying to make short-term investment decisions often leads to emotionally driven decisions, which historically has been potentially one of the worst strategies you can implement for your Bitcoin investing and analysis. Looking at the Fear and Greed Index, we can see an inverse correlation between sentiment on the current market and the current price. So long-term investments usually dampen the emotional ups and downs you'll experience when making short-term decisions. If you like this video, then please visit lookintobitcoin.com, where you can also consider becoming a site subscriber to gain access to live charts, in-depth newsletters, indicator alerts, private trading view scripts, and more, all for a fraction of the standard industry price. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.